Some wars don't end on the battlefield, they echo through the way we treat our heroes. Arnold Schwarzenegger hadn't stepped inside Penn Station in over a decade, but when his phone lit up with a single headline, "Veteran tased, Medal of Honor found on scene," he didn't hesitate. Because once, long ago, a man like that gave him something far greater than freedom. He gave him a reason to become more than just muscle and fame. What followed wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a performance. It was justice, the kind that doesn't ask for applause. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you believe respect must be earned, but never forgotten, don't forget to subscribe. Penn Station buzzed like a restless machine, each announcement echoing off the steel beams like distant thunder. Commuters drifted past in hurried waves, eyes glued to phones, minds elsewhere, feet dragging through the static rhythm of daily routine. But on bench 14, untouched by the rush, sat a man who'd outrun history itself. Harold "Hank" Morrison was 92 years old, his presence quiet but anchored like a stone in the tide. His back was straight despite age gnawing at his bones, and his hands, weathered, veined, deliberate, rested on a scuffed leather briefcase. He wore his marine dress blues, a uniform that clung to his thin frame with the precision of memory. The silver trimming on his sleeves caught the station's fluorescent light, casting slivers of reflection onto the floor like shrapnel from another era. Few noticed him, fewer cared, but one decoration gleamed too boldly to ignore. The Medal of Honor pinned above his heart. Some who passed slowed just enough to glance. A few veterans warned themselves, nodded respectfully and kept moving. Most didn't even see him. To them, he was just another old man waiting for a train. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly guess, was that this man, sitting silently amidst the chaos, held in his possession something more valuable than most of them would carry in a lifetime. Inside that battered case were classified documents, fragments of history from a war most had long since reduced to textbooks and black and white film reels. They were declassified now, but to Hank, they still carried weight. Not just ink and paper, but oaths and blood, and the names of men who'd never come home. Today, Hank was on a mission, one final journey, as he'd called it. He told his granddaughter she didn't need to drive him. Told her kindly, firmly, some journeys a man has to take alone. She hadn't argued, not really, because when Hank spoke in that tone, the one polished by war and worn by time, it left little room for protest. And so he boarded the train in Philadelphia that morning, bound for Washington, D.C., where he would hand-deliver the documents to the National Archives. It wasn't a demand, it was a responsibility. The kind they used to write into vows and dog tags. The kind men like Hank carried like second skin. But now he sat at Penn Station for a layover, the cold February wind from outside leaking in through the concrete seams and whistling against the windows. He didn't mind. It reminded him of the Korean mountains, of nights spent huddled in a foxhole with nothing but silence and snow. The ache in his joints was a familiar companion, so was solitude. He hadn't come here looking for attention, he never did. If anything, he preferred the quiet, but even quiet has a pulse. And today, that pulse was about to change. Above him, the departure board flickered, delays, track changes. White letters against a black backdrop of uncertainty. Hank remained still, eyes calm, posture straight. The world had shifted around him countless times. He had long since stopped trying to chase its rhythm. Now, he simply honored its echoes. His fingers drummed lightly on the briefcase, a habit born from decades of carrying secrets no one else was meant to know. Some of the files inside had passed through hands now long buried. Others bore codes he once broke under candlelight in wartime bunkers, his mind sharp even as shells shook the walls around him. These papers weren't relics, they were promises. And promises weren't made to be opened at checkpoints or poured through by scanners. They were meant to be delivered, by hand, by oath, by a man who understood their meaning. Security cameras blinked overhead, red dots dancing across the station like digital eyes. Somewhere behind those eyes, someone was watching. Hank didn't know it yet, but that someone had just flagged his case. Not because of what it was, but because of what it was. It wasn't plastic. It wasn't modern. It wasn't normal. And in a world terrified of the unexpected, not normal was more than enough to trigger suspicion. But Hank wasn't afraid, not of scanners, not of strangers, not even of the icy hands time had laid on his body. He had faced down far worse. Fear to him was just another battle that came and went. He had survived D-Day, Korea, 3 heart attacks. He wasn't about to flinch in a train station. And so he sat, briefcase in hand, unaware that somewhere in a windowless room nearby, a transit officer was squinting at his X-ray image, unaware that a name was being whispered across security radios, that protocols were being activated, that footsteps were already heading his way. His mission was simple: get to Washington, hand off the documents, and disappear like the good soldiers always did. But history doesn't always respect quiet exits. Sometimes it drags its heroes back into the light, whether they're ready or not. The first thing Hank noticed was the silence behind the footsteps. 3 men approached, not loudly, not carelessly, but with the deliberate quiet of people who had made up their minds before they even arrived. Their uniforms were clean, dark blue with gold trim, transit police badges pinned high, radios crackling low. The one in the middle, younger than Hank's youngest grandson, stepped forward. Officer Martinez. His name tag gleamed like it hadn't seen real use, only polish. "Sir, I need you to open that briefcase," he said. No greeting. No question, just an order, spoken with the weight of someone who thought age made a man small. Hank turned to face him slowly, like every movement cost something. His grip on the briefcase didn't tighten, it didn't need to. "Son, I've been carrying these documents since before you were born. They're classified materials being delivered under direct instruction to the National Archives." He reached into his inside jacket pocket, calmly, producing a folded letter with a pentagon letterhead. "This explains everything." Martinez didn't look down, his eyes didn't leave Hank's. "I don't care what that paper says. Open the case or we'll open it for you." The words hit harder than they needed to. Not because of their tone, but because of what they meant. This wasn't a request. This was a performance. For the other 2 officers, for the camera mounted above, for the power Martinez had waited his whole life to hold. Around them, the station continued to buzz, but pockets of stillness began forming. Commuters slowed, glanced, stopped. A few phones rose. A woman in a gray coat whispered something to her friend. "That man has a Medal of Honor. Look at his chest." But Martinez didn't look. He didn't want to see the medal. Seeing it might mean he had to reconsider. Hank inhaled slowly. The air was heavy with diesel fumes and burnt coffee, but he'd breathed worse. "Listen to me carefully, officer," he said, voice steady. "These documents are bound under wartime classification. They were only recently cleared for transfer, and I've been authorized to escort them personally. If you need confirmation, you're welcome to call the Department of Defense." Martinez didn't blink. His hand hovered near his taser now, the black plastic grip tapping lightly against his thigh. "We don't need to call anyone. We need you to comply. This is your last warning." "I'm not refusing," Hank said, "but I won't dishonor what's in this case. The law says these papers must be handed directly to federal custody. That's what I intend to do." The officer to Martinez's left shifted uncomfortably. "Rodriguez." His eyes flicked to Hank's uniform, then back to the floor. Maybe he saw what the crowd was beginning to see, that this wasn't just a stubborn old man. This was someone who had carried the weight of secrets that once shaped the world. A voice from the growing circles spoke up. "He's clearly a veteran. Look at his posture. Look at the way he's dressed." A few murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Phones were no longer just being held, they were recording, broadcasting. Martinez noticed. His jaw tightened. Pride doesn't mix well with public doubt. "Back away, ma'am," he barked. "This is official police business." But the woman didn't move. "That's a Medal of Honor. Do you even know what that means?" Hank turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Miss, I appreciate your concern. These officers are doing their job. Let's not make this harder." The words, meant to de-escalate, only added pressure. Martinez heard them as condescension. His ego prickled. His hand moved closer to the taser. "Sir, stand up and surrender the briefcase." "I'm asking you to follow protocol," Hank repeated. "I've served this country longer than you've worn that badge. These documents helped win a war. the man I was when I received that medal. He would have died before opening this case without orders. The silence that followed was different this time. Heavy, charged. Hank could feel it, the shift. There would be no reasonable ending here, not unless someone chose to listen. And no one was choosing to listen. Not the officers, not the system, not yet. Son, he said quietly, I've stood in places where every step might have been my last, where bullets didn't ask for permission and frostbite took men faster than gunfire. I'm not afraid of you or your taser, but I am disappointed. This isn't how we treat our own. Martinez's face hardened, but the flicker of hesitation was there. In that moment, something inside him stalled. A flash of a grandfather's face, a photograph on the mantel, a memory, but it wasn't enough. He looked back at his partners, the forming crowd, the blinking camera light above. And he did what many men do when they feel the world watching and fear looking weak. He leaned into the moment. Sir, you're now under arrest for non-compliance with a security screening. Stand up, or we will proceed with force. Around them, the terminal grew quieter still. The murmurs turned into gasps. A young man raised his voice. He's 92 years old. What's wrong with you? But Martinez didn't answer. He was already reaching for the cuffs. The taser was out now. No longer a threat, but a promise. Martinez's hand gripped it tight, finger dancing near the trigger. The hum of the station seemed to fall silent, as if the concrete itself was holding its breath. Hank stood slowly, not in defiance but with dignity, his briefcase still in hand, locked to him by memory and oath. Son, I said I'd come with you, he reminded, voice firm but calm. But this case doesn't move until federal hands take it. It was a line in the sand, not shouted, not forced, just there. And that quiet resistance rattled Martinez more than any act of defiance could. Drop the case now, Martinez barked, the words louder than necessary. He needed to assert control, needed to feel like this moment wasn't slipping. But it was, because around him, the station had transformed. What was once a river of travelers had frozen into an audience. A circle of onlookers, at least 50 strong, phones raised, eyes narrowed, silent judgment already forming. The camera doesn't lie, but it also doesn't forgive. Hank didn't drop the case. His knuckles whitened around the handle, not from fear, but resolve. I understand you have a job to do, he said, eyes level with Martinez, but I have a duty too. These documents saved lives. I won't betray that sacrifice by handing them over to someone who won't even call for confirmation. It wasn't rebellion, it was honor, but Martinez couldn't see it. He saw a man who refused an order, a challenge in public, the kind of moment that gets a junior officer written up, or worse, made into a meme. His radio crackled again, voices above him demanding updates, asking why this wasn't over yet. Every second made the hole deeper, and pride never carries a ladder. Sir, please, Officer Rodriguez whispered from the side, trying to pull him back from the edge. We can call it in, just give it a minute. But Martinez's eyes were locked, not on Hank, but on every phone camera in the room. They're recording, they're waiting, and in his mind, backing down would mean weakness. He felt the judgment before the verdict had even arrived. He's interfering with a security operation, Martinez declared loud enough for the crowd to hear. That's a federal offense. The irony sailed over his head, accusing a man who had risked his life defending federal secrets of breaking the law for protecting them. From the crowd, another voice rose. This is insane. He's wearing a Medal of Honor. What more do you need? A Vietnam vet stepped forward now, his jacket worn, his spine still straight. That man's done more for this country than any of you ever will. The statement echoed. It wasn't just sentiment, it was a spark. A younger man in army green joined him, then another. Veterans forming a barrier, not with weapons, but with presence. A silent line drawn around Hank. You want him? The Vietnam vet said, voice low and level. You go through us. The tension crackled, raw and dangerous. Martinez's radio squawked again, supervisors shouting over the static, but he tuned them out. The moment had swallowed him whole. This was no longer about policy or threat assessment. It was about control. About being the man in charge in front of everyone. I'm taking him into custody, he announced. He stepped forward with the zip ties already pulled, ready to make it quick, clean. But as he reached for Hank's arm, the old man's grip tightened on the briefcase. Not resistance, just a line being held. Martinez interpreted it wrong. Taser, 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 he shouted and pulled the trigger. The sound was brief. The impact was not. Electricity surged through Hank's frail frame. His knees buckled. His uniform crumpled. The briefcase flew from his hand and landed with a metallic thud, popping open as its decades-old clasps gave way. Papers spilled across the floor, yellowed, stamped, full of codes and names that once turned tides. The gasp from the crowd came all at once, like a single breath inhaled too fast. Someone screamed. Others surged forward. The Vietnam vet dropped to his knees, checking Hank's pulse. "You killed him," a woman sobbed. "You just tasered a 92-year-old war hero." Martinez froze. The taser hung limp in his hand. Reality, fast and brutal, began to catch up. Rodriguez called for medical immediately, his voice shaking as he tried to hold back a crowd that no longer saw them as officers. Phones caught every second. Streams were live. Screens lit up in hands around the world. On one of them, in a private office in Los Angeles, a man paused his call mid-sentence as he saw the headline scroll past the bottom of the feed. He clicked the video, watched in silence, recognized the medal, recognized the man. Then Arnold Schwarzenegger reached for his phone. Back at Penn Station, EMTs arrived, parting the crowd like a wedge. They worked on Hank in full view of cameras, his breathing shallow, his pulse flickering. A paramedic shook his head. This kind of shock at his age, it could go either way. Around them, the scene dissolved into chaos, but the briefcase, scattered, violated, still lay open, a symbol of everything this moment had shattered. Rodriguez knelt beside it, not touching the papers, just staring, and the crowd stared too, at the fallen hero, at the officer who made the call, at the country that let it happen. But the story wasn't over, not yet. The first black SUV appeared like a phantom, gliding to a stop just outside the east entrance of Penn Station. Then came another, and another, 6 in total. Their engines whispered, but their presence roared. They didn't block traffic. They consumed it. Pedestrians stopped. Camera crews pivoted. Officers on the perimeter exchanged panicked glances as tinted windows reflected their own confusion. No one knew who was inside, but everyone could feel it. Something was shifting. Inside the terminal, chaos had calcified into stunned paralysis. Hank lay unconscious on the concrete floor, chest barely rising under the weight of his dress blues. The paramedics hovered over him like a broken prayer. Nearby, his briefcase lay open, its contents being carefully gathered by a pair of suited individuals in black gloves. Not transit police, not local law enforcement. These were federal, and they didn't bother introducing themselves. They moved with a kind of quiet urgency that spoke of darker clearances and deeper chains of command. And then came the moment. A single door opened. From the lead SUV, a man stepped out, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the deliberate pace of someone who had walked through storms and returned. Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't wear a uniform. He didn't need one. He wore a plain black jacket over a gray turtleneck, dark sunglasses resting in one hand. His face was grim, carved by time and resolve. The press cameras, already rolling, struggled to catch up as he entered the building. He didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the sea of reporters screaming his name. Instead, he moved through the terminal like gravity itself, escorted not by bodyguards, but by silence. When he reached the security cordon, agents moved aside, not because they were told to, but because they knew. He had once governed the state. Now he was here for something bigger, not a role, a reckoning. Officer Martinez turned just in time to see him approach. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by dread. Arnold stopped 2 feet from him. They stood there, the action star turned statesman facing the transit cop who had just tasered a national hero. For a moment, no one spoke. "Where is the man?" Arnold asked, voice quiet but razor-edged. Martinez stammered, "Paramedics, over there." He collapsed. He wouldn't comply. "I followed procedure." Arnold looked past him to the medics working desperately on Hank's still frame. Then to the open briefcase. Then back to Martinez. "Procedure," he said, the word sour in his mouth. I've known Harold Morrison since I was a young immigrant trying to learn English from war stories printed on the back of library books. I met him once when I was still nobody. He taught me that heroes don't need spotlights, just purpose. He gave this country more than you or I ever will. And you couldn't give him 5 minutes to make a phone call. Martinez's throat bobbed. He didn't answer. Arnold turned to the officers nearby. Secure that man's badge, he said, and his weapon. Now, Rodriguez hesitated, then moved, slowly, but with finality. The taser was removed, the badge too. Martinez didn't resist, not anymore. His shoulders had already begun to fold inward, the weight of the moment collapsing down. Outside, the media had caught wind. Schwarzenegger at Penn Station was already trending, photos flashing across every news app in real time. Anchors scrambled to contextualize, to explain why a former governor and movie star had just taken over a crime scene in Midtown Manhattan. Back inside, Arnold walked to where the paramedics were stabilizing Hank for transport. His eyes scanned the old man's pale face, the uniform stained with dust, the Medal of Honor still pinned to his chest like a lighthouse in a storm. He crouched carefully and spoke low. "Sergeant Morrison, you don't know this yet, but the entire country is watching you, and we will not let this be your last chapter." One of the agents leaned in. "Sir, classified materials are being photographed by bystanders. We've recovered most, but—" "Handle it," Arnold said, quietly, discreetly, "and anyone who recorded footage of the briefcase, offer compensation and delete. Make them understand what's at stake." "Yes, sir." Rodriguez approached, his face pale. "Sir, I didn't know. I mean, I tried. I told Martinez to wait." Arnold stood and faced him. "I saw the footage. I know what you tried to do. That will be taken into account. But from now on, don't try, do." Outside the station, a perimeter had been set up. Protesters were already arriving, holding signs. Some veterans, some civilians, all angry, all awake now to something broken in the system. But for a brief moment, the energy shifted. When they saw Arnold emerge at the platform doors, walking beside the stretcher that carried Hank Morrison, a hush fell. He didn't wave, didn't pose. He simply helped guide the gurney to the ambulance, one hand resting gently on the side rail. Reporters shouted questions, none of which he answered. But the image was enough. A man once known for blowing things up on screen, now quietly shielding a man who had held a nation together with his silence. Before the ambulance doors closed, Arnold leaned in and said one last thing to Hank. Words the cameras couldn't hear, but whatever they were, Hank's hand moved, just slightly, a twitch, a response. As the vehicle pulled away, Arnold faced the press. "What happened here," he said, "is bigger than one officer. It's about who we choose to honor, who we choose to listen to, and how easily we forget that not every uniform is still being worn." He turned without another word, leaving behind the chaos he had just recentered. Not as an actor, not as a politician, but as a man who had seen what it meant to be powerless and who chose, when the time came, not to look away. The room was quiet, not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that hums with machines and uncertainty. Monitors blinked in soft pulses, tracking a rhythm more fragile than ever. Harold Morrison lay in a hospital bed at Walter Reed Medical Center, wrapped in white sheets, a thin oxygen tube resting just beneath his nose. He looked smaller somehow, as though the years had finally caught up with him in the span of a single fall. But he was breathing, and for now that was enough. Arnold sat beside him. The chair was uncomfortable, but he didn't shift. He hadn't moved much since the ambulance brought them here. No press, no entourage, just him. Just the man who had once been strong enough to carry enemy codes on his back and never let a single one fall into the wrong hands. The doctors had done what they could. They said the taser had triggered a cardiac episode, mild, considering the circumstances, but dangerous at his age. What they didn't say out loud, what lingered in their eyes, was that Hank had survived worse. And yet no one knew if he would wake, until he did. It wasn't dramatic. No gasp, no sudden sit-up, just the slow, fluttering lift of eyelids, a blink, then another. Arnold leaned forward, not speaking yet, not wanting to startle him. Hank's lips moved, barely a whisper. "The case?" he asked. Arnold smiled softly, The kind of smile that doesn't celebrate but confirms, safe. Every page accounted for, you did it. For a second, Hank just stared at the ceiling, letting the words sink in. Then his hand twitched slightly on the blanket. Good, he whispered. Good. There was a pause. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment didn't need much. Arnold broke the silence first. You almost died in front of the whole country, he said. Hank turned his head slightly, wincing at the effort. Not the first time I've come close, he murmured. Just the first time cameras were there. They both chuckled just once. It was weak, but real. You didn't have to come, Hank added, voice rasping. Arnold looked at him for a moment. I did. Because I've been you, not in uniform, but I've walked into rooms where they sized me up before they heard a word. I know what it's like to be doubted because of where you come from, what you sound like, how old you are. When I saw what they did to you, I saw my father, and I saw the man I promised myself I would never become. Hank didn't speak, but his eyes held something steady, something knowing. You stood up when I couldn't, Arnold said. I was a kid with nothing but muscles and an accent. You told me the only way to build something that lasts is to serve something bigger than yourself. I never forgot that. A nurse entered quietly, adjusted Hank's IV, nodded at Arnold, and stepped back out. The moment resumed without comment. They say I might have to testify, Hank said after a while. Congress, cameras, lawyers, you don't have to do anything, Arnold replied. You've done enough. But if you want to, I'll be right there. Hank closed his eyes again, as if weighing something deep inside. I'm tired, Arnold. This fight, it might take years. Maybe I should just let it go. Arnold leaned forward, voice lower now. You survived wars, you lost brothers. You built a legacy no one can erase. But if you let this pass, the next man they tase might not get back up. This isn't about you anymore. It's about every veteran they'll question after you. You're the one voice they can't ignore. Hank didn't answer right away, but when he opened his eyes again, there was fire behind them, not rage, duty. Then we finish what we started, he said. Arnold nodded. Outside the hospital, the world was still raging. Media trucks lined the curb. Protesters held signs demanding justice. And inside, two men, one who had worn the uniform and one who had worn the burden of a different kind of war, sat shoulder to shoulder, ready for what came next. The hearing room in Washington was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled every available seat, cameras rolled silently from the back wall, and rows of onlookers stood shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks to glimpse the man at the center of the storm. Harold Morrison sat at the witness table in full dress blues, his Medal of Honor pinned clean and unmistakable against his chest. His posture was stiff from pain, but his eyes were clear. They had asked him if he needed a wheelchair. He declined. They asked if he wanted someone else to read his statement. He declined that too. When they asked if he was strong enough to testify, he only said, I've stood through worse. The chairman of the committee gavelled the session into order. Today's subject wasn't a single officer or a broken procedure. It was a nation's relationship with its veterans. It was the question no one wanted to ask. How had we allowed this to happen in plain sight, with cell phones rolling, and still called ourselves civilized? Martinez sat off to the side, his lawyer beside him, jaw tight, tie looser than it had been earlier that morning. The defense had filed for the officer's absence, but public pressure and political fallout made it impossible. He was here. And every second was a reckoning. The chairman invited the prosecution forward. The government's lead counsel stepped into the spotlight. She began not with outrage, but with footage. The moment the taser hit Hank, the crowd's reaction. The briefcase flying open, the metal glinting beneath fluorescent lights. Every pixel was real, every second undeniable. They outlined how Hank had identified himself, presented Pentagon documentation, and followed classified protocol to the letter. They detailed how Martinez ignored not only federal procedures, but multiple chances to de-escalate. Then they played a second clip, the crowd pleading, a woman's voice, that's a Medal of Honor. Another, he's 92, what's wrong with you? The defense waited until the room quieted before beginning. They didn't deny what happened. They didn't argue the taser wasn't used. They argued the context. In today's environment, said the attorney, suspicious luggage must be taken seriously. This wasn't a young man in uniform. This was an elderly man with a sealed briefcase, refusing to comply with a lawful search. He wasn't treated as a hero, the lawyer admitted, because no one told my client he was one. But someone did, a voice echoed, and it was Hank's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean into dramatics. He simply read his statement, eyes steady, hands calm. "I have served this country for over 70 years, he said. "I have carried secrets across oceans, across borders, across time. On the day of the incident, I was fulfilling one last mission, delivering what remained of that responsibility to its rightful home. I showed my credentials. I offered verification. I followed every directive written for the transport of classified materials. I did not resist. I did not raise my voice, and I did not back down from my duty." The room was silent as he paused, letting the words settle. "I've been shot at. I've held dying men in my arms, but nothing prepared me for the moment I realized my country might see me as a threat because I stood too still, spoke too calmly, and carried my history in a case too old for their scanners." He closed the folder, not for effect, but because that was all he needed to say. After him came testimonies, veterans who saw themselves in Hank, experts on law enforcement protocol. Finally, a representative from the Pentagon confirmed the documents Hank carried were authentic, sensitive, and correctly handled. Had the briefcase been opened by unauthorized personnel, it could have triggered a separate federal investigation. By the end, there was no debate left, just gravity. The committee's final report was scathing. It called for immediate reforms to security training, mandatory veteran identification protocols, and penalties for officers who failed to follow federal classification procedures. But more than that, it delivered a message. Honor is not something you get to ignore just because it walks slower than you. As the hearing adjourned, the chairman leaned over his mic. "Sergeant Morrison, on behalf of this country, I apologize. What happened to you was not a mistake. It was a failure. The cameras captured Hank standing to leave. He did it without help. Outside, reporters shouted questions, flashes lit the air, but he just kept walking." Arnold waited at the curb. He didn't speak either, just opened the car door and stood tall as Hank climbed in. The battle had moved from platform to podium, from concrete to committee, but the mission was far from over. 2 years later, the morning was quiet again. A different kind of quiet, the kind that settles over memory, not uncertainty, the kind that lives in wreaths and folded flags. Harold Morrison passed away at age 94, peacefully, with his granddaughter holding his hand. The country he had served for over 7 decades paused, if only briefly, to remember a man who had once carried its secrets, and later, its shame. The funeral at Arlington was attended by hundreds, veterans, public officials, strangers who only knew his name from headlines but felt they owed him something. The Medal of Honor lay in a glass case near the casket, beside the briefcase he never let go of. On the far end of the service, a tall figure stood silently in black. Arnold didn't approach the podium. He didn't need to. When the moment came, he simply stepped forward, placed his hand on the casket, and said one line. He kept his promise. "Now it's our turn." In the months that followed, the Harold Morrison Veterans Dignity Act passed both chambers of Congress with overwhelming support. It required enhanced training for all transit and security officers, mandated real-time verification channels for veterans carrying federal materials, and established legal safeguards for elderly service members traveling alone. More than legislation, it was a shift. Train stations, airports, courthouses, they changed. Signs appeared reminding officers to check twice before assuming. Protocols were updated. Lives were spared from the kinds of mistakes that nearly ended Hank's. A memorial plaque was installed inside Penn Station. It was simple, a bronze relief of Hank in uniform, seated on that bench, briefcase at his side. Below it, a quote from his testimony, "I did not resist. I simply remembered my oath. Every day commuters passed it. Some didn't notice, others did, and a few stopped. Veterans especially, some saluted, others just stood still." One morning, a young transit officer approached the plaque, new to the job, nervous. He read the quote, then turned to find a man standing nearby, watching quietly. Sir, the officer said, I just wanted to say, thank you for making this place better. Arnold nodded, offering the faintest smile. Sometimes, the most important battles, he said, aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with memory, with dignity, and with the refusal to look away. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd, like a man who'd already done what he came to do. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.